Good evening.
Good evening.
Don, I'm still just so tickled by what you said. I'm still just thinking about it. When I was in 7th grade, I remember I got my first pair of glasses, and I didn't know I was blind before I got them. I walked out from the optometrist, and I put the glasses on, and it was like, there are flowers and there's trees over there. I never knew there were flowers and there's trees over there. I never knew you were supposed to be able to see people's faces from far away. You know, everyone just looked like a blur, and then it's like, oh, you can actually tell who that is from way over here. And so
Yeah.
that was kind of nice. And it does, in a way, I guess, kind of remind me of what we're talking about as far as, being able to see people clearly, being able to kind of see people the way that Jesus describes in Mark chapter 16 and verse 15. If you'd like to open this evening to Mark chapter 16 and verse 15, I can't remember who, but there was a famous actress, and they said, you know what the point of getting to know someone is about? Getting to know someone is about judging them. And, for some people, that's really true, isn't it? It's, I think it was supposed to be a shocking and funny statement when they said it, but some people really do kind of see others that way, that getting to know someone is about comparing yourself to them. Getting to know someone is about deciding how you think about them, where to put them in relation to what you think about other people. But that's not really what Jesus' focus was. Notice Mark chapter 16 and verse 15. Here at the very end of Jesus' time on earth, he's been crucified, he's been laid in the grave, he's risen from the dead, he's seen the apostles over a number of days, and in fact more than 500 people he's seen over this time, and now he and the 12 are gathered together on the Mount of Olives, and just before he ascends into heaven, he says in verse 15, he said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." And it's a pretty simple statement. There's just not a lot of complexity to it. It's a pretty simple command. Go into everywhere and preach this message to everyone that you come across. And despite the fact that it is such a simple and such a not complex command, I think that it's easy to maybe oversimplify the way that this should be done. And I think maybe the best way to kind of consider what exactly did Jesus mean when he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, is to look at how Mark describes him doing it in the book of Mark. And so I'd like to go backwards and go all the way back to chapter 1 and look at just a few references of how Jesus did just exactly what he told them to do, because the truth is, Jesus never commanded us to do anything that he himself wasn't able to or willing to do himself. And I think in large part, you see this is the conclusion and the finale of the book of Mark, because Mark is kind of saying, isn't this really what he did all along? And doesn't he give us this great example of how exactly to go about doing this all the way through the book of Mark? And really, it doesn't even start with Jesus, it starts with John the Baptist. Notice chapter 1, Mark chapter 1 and verse 4, when it says, John came baptizing in the wilderness and preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. Now, he starts the book of Mark and he says this is going to be the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then in reference to Mark, he goes back to the Old Testament, he goes back to Isaiah, and he says that he's sending this messenger who is going to be preparing your way, the way of Jesus, before you. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord and make his path straight. To come and help people see that they need to get ready for Jesus. To come and help people see that there is something great coming and that we should be ready to receive it when it does. And so it says that he came along, and as he came, he was baptizing people. And that, you see, that words that have that ing, the ing ending, the idea of this is something that they were doing continuously, something that as they went along, he was baptizing them and preaching a repentance for the remission of sins. And so he begins doing it to prepare the way. But then notice how it describes Jesus. You can skip ahead to chapter 1 and verse 16. Verse 16, the way that Mark describes Jesus, it says, as he walked. He was just out walking. He didn't have maybe he did have a particular place to go, or maybe he didn't, but as he was just out walking by the Sea of Galilee, there he saw Simon and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And so Jesus began to preach the gospel message to them. Now, maybe he didn't give them the whole plan of salvation in one moment, but he began to teach the message. He said, "Follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men." Notice chapter 2 and verse 14. Chapter 2 and verse 14. In Mark chapter 2 and verse 14, he's describing Jesus. It says in verse 13 that he went out again by the sea, and all the multitude came to him, and he taught them. And then it says he left there, and as he was passing by, as he was doing something else, as he was going, as he was passing by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." And so he arose, and he followed him. And this is over and over again in Mark chapter 4 and verse 4. I like the way it says it in Mark chapter 4 and verse 4. This is the parable of the sower. And so this is Jesus talking. It's not what Jesus was doing. But the way he says it is so indicative of what Jesus was doing in the other places. Mark chapter 4 and verse 4. And it happened. This is just a happenstance of the moment. And it happened as he sowed that some seed fell by the wayside. And then he goes on to describe where all the places the seed fell. But the farmer was out just spreading the seed wherever he was. It happened that he was on the road, so he spread the seed there. It happened that he was in a rocky place, so he spread the seed there. It happened that he was in a thorny place, so he spread the seed there. It happened that he was in good soil, so he spread the seed there. The farmer wasn't so concerned with where he was. It's just wherever he was. As he was there, he spread the seed. Jesus says the seed in the parable is the word of God. And he says the farmer is the one who's out spreading the word of God wherever he goes, whatever he's doing. Chapter 10 and verse 17. In chapter 10 and verse 17, Jesus is doing what Jesus always did. It says, now as he was going out on the road, he wasn't on the road, but as he was going out onto the road, as he stepped onto the road, one came running and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" And so Jesus answers his question. And, maybe, Jesus knew things that we don't know. Maybe he knew this guy was coming. Maybe he didn't. But the point was, he was ready to answer the question regardless of what he was doing as he stepped out onto the road. And there are many more like this. We could look at Mark chapter 10 and verse 46 when it says that as they came to Jericho, now they came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, there was blind Bartimaeus. We could look at chapter 11 and verse 27. It says, then they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, and so that's kind of fun. 11:27 says, as he was walking in the temple. 13:1 says, as he went out of the temple. And then 13:3 says, as he sat on the Mount of Olives across from the temple. And so, it's just everywhere. It's when he walks in the temple and when he walks out of the temple. And then when he walks across the street to a different place from the temple. All of these places, as he goes, as he does this, as he does that, he sees these opportunities to preach the gospel to every creature. And he takes the opportunities as far as people will let him. Chapter 14 and verse 3. And being in Bethany, at the house of Simon the leper, he sat at a table, it says, as he sat at a table. And so sometimes he wasn't even out. Sometimes he was home or in someone else's home and just sitting at a table as he sat at the table. And so you notice all of the variety of places that Jesus was when he preached the gospel. And I think that's especially important when you look at Jesus' example, because I think sometimes from Mark chapter 16 and verse 15, when it says to preach the gospel to every creature, the word preach puts a certain thought in our mind. When you think of preaching, you think of this, most people. When you think of preaching, you think of what a preacher does behind a podium in the middle of a worship service. But you notice when Jesus was preaching the gospel to these people, all the ones that we looked at, other than the time that as he walked into the temple, he wasn't even inside of a building most of the time. He wasn't behind a podium most of the time. Now, there are some occasions. You think Mark chapter 2, he stood up and he read Isaiah to them. There were some occasions when he was in an official worship assembly and preach to people in that way. But most of the time, it's just as he was walking down the street. And you think preaching is something where you stand in front of a whole bunch of people and you speak very loudly, and that's in the church. That's something that not every person can do in any given situation. It has to be in a general assembly. It has to be a man, and so forth and so on. But here, what he does most of the time is not restricted to those moments. It's as he sits by a well talking to a woman, as he comes across someone who has some need. As he does these things, he's not necessarily raising his voice. He's not necessarily addressing a large crowd. Now, sometimes he is, and you think he goes out onto a boat so that people can hear, the multitudes can. Sometimes it's multitudes, and sometimes it's one or two people. And this is what the Bible is calling preaching. And there's general worship preaching, what we're doing now. And then there's just having a conversation. I think maybe it would have been easier if they had translated that word proclaiming instead of preaching, which in our mind is this idea that you're just proclaiming it in conversation. You're just talking about it with the people that you come across as you were walking down the aisle at the grocery store, as you were sitting in the lobby of the oil place that you get your oil changed for your car, as you are, scrolling on Facebook, as you are, whatever you're doing. If you were talking about the gospel, if you were building up to conversations so that you can talk about the gospel, if you are building relationships that give you the opportunity to talk about the gospel, you are, in that sense, proclaiming or preaching the message that Jesus gave all of us to proclaim. And I really think when you look at Mark chapter 16 and verse 15, when you look at Mark chapter 16 and verse 15, you really do get, I think, this sense of the emphasis that Jesus puts on this. He says, go, and really the tense of that Greek verb is as you are going. And that's really, I wish they would have translated it that way, because I think it would be easier for us to make that connection. Mark says it over and over again. As Jesus did this, as Jesus did that. And then he literally says in Mark 16:15, as you are going. And there just is this natural sort of language connection there to what he did, as he did this, and what he commands us. As you are going about your day, as you are going here and there. And so go is a lot less about where you are going. Go tends to bring up the idea of destination. I think I saw a poster at the Family Bible School from is it Dr. Seuss? It says, the places you'll go. And kind of the emphasis of the idea of go is the destination that you're going to get to. And so a lot of times when we read this verse and we think about the command, we think go as, where do I go? And so we plan mission trips, or we plan these things of going to a particular place in order to do something to teach people the gospel. And that's right. That's a right thing to do. Remember Acts chapter 13 and verse 3? Acts chapter 13 and verse 3. We have this apostolic example. The Apostle Paul gives us an example of this that shows us that this is the right thing to do. In Acts chapter 13 and verse 3, when Paul is really beginning to be used by the church to preach the gospel, it says in verse 3, it says, having fasted and prayed and laid hands on them, they sent them on their way. And particularly, they were sending them to go and to preach the gospel to a certain place. And so they made a plan to preach the gospel, a mission trip. That's what they're doing. The elders of the church here planned a mission trip, and they picked a preacher to go on the mission trip, and they sent him away. That's a part of going. But I'm afraid that that's not really the emphasis of Mark chapter 16 and verse 15. It's a lot less about planning mission trips and a lot more about you in your everyday life as you are going, being ready as a daily focus. And so that was Jesus' command, to be looking for those opportunities wherever you happen to be. That's the idea of Ephesians 5:16. Do you remember Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 16? He says, redeem the time. Whatever time you have today, redeem means, to buy it back, to make the most of it, to not waste it. that we have been given a certain amount of time today, and we have lots of things that we have to do, and I'm sure all of our chore lists are probably longer than this day would allow us to do. And so, as you're fulfilling your chore list and you're checking those boxes and you're meeting the needs of your family and you're meeting the needs of the church, just as you're going about those things, perhaps there's an opportunity to begin to build a relationship or to grow a relationship you've already started, to get to the place where you can teach someone the gospel as you go along. And that's really, you notice that's the method he gives us. The method is to fulfill it as we are going. He tells us the content of the message. He says in verse 15, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And that, of course, gospel is good news. He describes that a little further in verse 16. He says, he who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned. And so if going is kind of like a river, you know how a river, it follows a path, and as it follows that path, it smooths all the stones that it comes across, right? It just continuously rubs and rubs against those stones and smooths them down. If going is like a river, that you just go down the path that you happen to be going down and smooth all the stones that you come across to prepare them to receive the gospel to the best of your ability, then the content that he gives us is more like stepping on stairs. He gives us sort of, this is what our goals are. Your goal is not always to tell everyone you come across the entire plan of salvation in 5 minutes and then, thank you, ma'am, and move on. The goal is not always to present in one moment all the ways that the Church of Christ is different than every other denomination to the person that you just met in the grocery store. He says the goal is that they believe. That's really the first step. The goal is just simply that they believe. That sometimes is a big step for some people. That sometimes is hours and hours of conversation over a long span of time. That sometimes is a lot of work, that you get them to the place where they're even ready to hear what the gospel says because they've begun to believe it. When people start to invest in your relationship with them, when people start to tell you things that they are you laughing at me saying infest? Yeah, I thought so. Yes. When people start to tell you things personal in their lives that they're struggling with or that they need help with, when people start to show that they are trusting in you, then sometimes you have an opportunity then to help them grow their belief by pointing them to the solutions found in the Bible. He who believes, because it's the person who believes who will want the cleansing that baptism offers. And so start with baptism, and maybe you'll get somebody wet. Start with belief. They're convicted, they know it, and they want it. You save a soul. And he says that's the third step, the third goal that we're looking for is he who believes and is baptized will be saved. Work on having someone believe, on showing them and building their belief, and they'll be ready to hear about baptism, and they will be saved. But that's why he follows that with, he who does not believe will be condemned. Because even if they choose to be baptized, and they probably won't, it won't mean anything to them. They might get in the water to get you to stop talking about it. You've annoyed them into the water, and that can happen. You can annoy someone in the water just to get you to stop, but it didn't mean anything. And so I heard one of my teachers in school, he put it this way. He said, with every conversation, our goal really is just to get someone 1 minute closer to obeying the gospel. You think 1 minute or one baby step. If you think of reaching baptism as a 60-minute clock, and someone, some people are on the 30, and some people are on the 45, and some people are on the 0. Those people are going to take a lot of baby steps, 60 baby steps, not literally, but for the picture, 60 baby steps to get to baptism. And when you come across them in the Dairy Queen, or at the Walmart, or you bump into them at your kids' soccer or basketball games, with that conversation, you just want to get them 1 minute closer. You just want to say something or open the door or encourage them just 1 minute, because that's all one conversation usually could accomplish. Now, some people are eager, right? They're ready for it, and they'll let you go 5 minutes or 10 minutes closer, and some people don't even want to go the 1 minute. But your goal, just 1 minute closer every time you see them, a little bit closer, and to see people as those who need salvation more than you see them in any other way, so that every conversation you have has that goal of getting them 1 minute closer. And that's why he says that our focus is on their belief, so that they want cleansing, and therefore they can have salvation. Sometimes we start with salvation and wonder, well, why don't people respond to that? People don't know they need salvation. People don't know that God cares about them. And so they hear that they're doing things wrong and that they need salvation, and that just sounds like criticism. What they need to hear is that look at the accounts in Acts, look at the way that the gospel letters are written. Doesn't Paul always start with the positive things, except for one time, Galatians, but every other time? He starts with all the ways that they're blessed, all the things he's thankful for, all the things that God has done for them. Start with building people's belief in what God has done for them, what he offers them. Build their belief in what God offers them. Then they'll be open to the fact that they need cleansing, they need baptism. Then they'll be eager for salvation, and they'll hear out all the things that they need to change. But so often I hear Christians talk to strangers and say things like, well, what you're doing is sinful, before they even know their name. Or what you're doing is not according to the Bible, or it's not how God set up the church, or it's not how we should worship, before they even really have a relationship. And, maybe there are occasions where that's the case, but most of the time, it's just getting people one tiny step closer, little by little, by building their belief in God's goodness, in God's love, in God's mercy, and also that God is a just God who will bring wrath at the end of all things. They build a belief in who God is as a whole, so that they want that salvation and cleansing. And then he finally gives us who our audience is. He says, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Kind of the way that it's phrased is to the creatures, every one. There is nobody who is exempt from this, which means that this is how we should see every person. When we, you run into your kid's soccer coach on the frozen food aisle at the Albertsons or the Berkshires or the Walmart or wherever, the spring market, and you think, man, this guy's a jerk to my kid. I don't like this guy. But Jesus said, love your enemies. Jesus said, pray for those who use you, and even the ones who are kind of rude to your children. Whoever we come across, first and foremost, we say, I wonder if this person knows the gospel. I wonder if this person has a relationship with Jesus Christ. I wonder if this person wants salvation. And then we do our best to figure out where they are, so we can help build their belief to the point where they want it as much as or more than you want them to want it. Little by little, step by step, as we go, as we sit at a table, as we talk with our friends, as we meet new strangers, as we worship, as we are interrupted by somebody while we're trying to do something busy and important. Is it hard to do? For me it is. I hate being interrupted. You're really thinking about something and you're really in the middle of something, and somebody comes and they're like, I really need to talk to you right now. I am busy. Jesus did that a lot, didn't he? He didn't say I'm busy. That's not what Jesus did. He was interrupted a lot, is what I'm trying to say. He was in the middle of things a lot. You remember the time that Jairus came and said, my daughter is dying, and so he's going to save this girl's life. And then there's that woman who reaches out and grabs his hem, and all the power, not all, but the power flows out, and he stops in the middle of going to save a girl's life so he can build the faith of this woman who has been struggling for 12 years. As he went to save someone's life, he stopped to build her faith just a little bit more, a little tick at a time. Jesus walked with the apostles for 3 years. And for 3 years, they never really quite got what he was doing. For 3 years, he told them over and over again about his death, about what to expect. And then even in Acts chapter 1, when he was ascending into heaven, they said, will you now restore your kingdom to Israel? They still didn't quite get what he was doing. But for 3 years, he took every opportunity he could to patiently just build 1 minute at a time, every little chance that he could, to grow their faith and to get them just a little bit closer to understanding what they needed to. Sometimes people understand it very quickly. Those are the exciting moments. Sometimes it takes a lifetime before someone really gets it. And we recently baptized a woman who is not as young as some of us and not as old as some of us either. And we're so grateful that any point in our lives, God is always there and ready to accept us. And that we have the opportunity, whatever point someone's life is in, to get them just a little bit closer. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he says, Apollos watered and I planted. Maybe it's the other way around. But it's always God that gives the increase. We all have just that little part to play, that little tick by tick to get someone closer. We see each person as an opportunity to make them one tick closer. Then maybe eventually they'll get there and God will give them the increase. If we can help you this evening with anything, if there's anything that we can do to strengthen you, to counsel you, to pray for you, to guide you, if there are any questions you have about your own salvation, about how close you are to the kingdom of heaven, about how close you are to the salvation that God provides and the home that he offers us in heaven, if there's anything that we can do for you tonight, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.